Welcome to the Dialectic by the Rajput and the Wasp. And you can guess who's who from the accents each one of us has. Today we are going to make sense of Iran's conflict with Israel and the US. Glenn, very simple topic, isn't it, today?
Well, before we get to that, if only I spoke English the way my mother did, because she spoke what is called, nobody knows this term anymore. Spoke what is called transatlantic English.
You've
She was
explained it to me.
American, but it was the language of the establishment elite of the Northeast and the ruling circles of America, spoken really from the last quarter of the 19th century until about the year 1955 or 60, and it sort of aped, or one could say emulated, if one wanted to be more positive, the British. But no one speaks that way anymore because it was viewed as completely affected and invented, and at least the latter is true. But I would have sounded more impressive if that were the case. But unfortunately, I've degenerated from my mother's generation, so you'll have to bring the refinement for us.
There we go. So, a very simple topic, Iran. And those of you who think of Iran as a land of bearded mullahs who pass death sentences against authors like Salman Rushdie, that nice bloke who went to Cambridge and was recently stabbed in America, by a Sunni, by the way, not by a Shia. But anyway, it was Khomeini who passed a death sentence against good old Salman for writing these satanic verses. And like me, of course, he grew up in India, but far cleverer than me, although not in all aspects. And those of you who think of Iran as that land of bearded fundamentalists wanting to unfurl the flag of Shia Islam around the world might be surprised to learn that fundamentally Iran is one of the great ancient civilizations. The Persian Empire is legendary. We know how Alexander conquered Persia. We know how the Persian Empire, in some form or another, survived. Of course, Persia, as foreigners call it, or Iran, as some of the natives would say, has been around forever. And after falling to Islam, it made a comeback because although it adopted Islam, it adopted a different version of Islam. It adopted Shia Islam, which some can argue it was in keeping with its royalist past. And modern Iran arguably begins in 1505. The Safavid.
Here, Atul, let me jump in for just a second as you embark us. I'm not being facetious on the organic historical explanation as to why Persia and Iran were, but are significant, by prefacing this with just a really brief description of how Iran and Persia did or didn't fit into the worldview that I, as a foreign policy student, this has been my life. This is what my degrees are in, what my life has been on, perceived from the West, from the Western perspective. And I think it's illuminating by the ignorance it reveals, actually. So what counted in the world of the East for someone of my generation and education, which was unusually focused on this sort of issue? It was to the east were the Russians and the Ottomans. Then one could go around and get on the other side of them, and India counted, or the subcontinent counted, because it was British. And then China counted because it was large, historic, and also under the sway, really, of the West. That's it. Persia and Iran only counted if one were a fan of studying, an amateur of the ancients, back to Cyrus the Great and the Romans. It literally sort of disappeared from one's consciousness or attention, which ignores a significant part of the world geographically and with regard to significance politically and culturally. So, with that blind spot as an important shaping element in how my predecessors and of course seniors in the foreign ministries of Western countries saw the world, I pass it to you because I think that the blindness is relevant.
So, Glenn, we are all blind in different ways. I think if you were in India and you lived during the time of my grandparents, you thought that the world centered around Varanasi, and all you needed to do was pray, give big sums of money to say the Brahmins and book your place in heaven. And of course, dipping in the Ganges would wash you from wash away all the sins, would absolve you from all the sins. But let's go back to a perspective of Iran from India. Everyone remembers 1757 today, both in the East and in the West. That is the Battle of Plassey. That's when Robert Clive beats the Nawab of Bengal, and it is the beginning of the British Empire in India. Note that this happens before the Declaration of Independence, 19 years before the Declaration of Independence in 1776. So Britain would lose America, but Britain would gain India. And that is super important to learn. So, but from an Indian perspective, 1757 and the conquest of India would never have happened had it not been for 1738 and 1739. Why? Because an Iranian military genius, compared often to Alexander, compared often to Julius Caesar, invaded India. He destroyed the Mughal Empire. He's often called the last great Asiatic military conqueror. His name was Nader Shah. And Nader Shah, when he comes to India, he basically sacks Delhi. The Kohinoor diamond, which is now in the crown of the British king, until recently Queen Elizabeth II, now of course King Charles, was taken from Iran, but the Iranians took it from India. And in 1738, once Nader Shah invades India, and he stays on till 1739. On 22nd March 1739, in 6 hours, Iranian troops killed 30,000 Indians, roughly. That's one estimate. And the Afsharid troops, because that was his dynasty, just casually also takes 10,000 women and children away as slaves, apart from all the gold and silver and the precious jewels and diamonds. And Indian history is intertwined with Iranian history because the official language of India from 1192 to 1858 was Farsi, Persian. Revenue records were kept in Farsi. We do not know who owned the land because no one speaks Farsi anymore in India, and land records before 1858 are inaccessible. The Taj Mahal was built for a Persian princess, a Persian queen, and of course caused the death of millions because of overtaxation. Any clever Persian or Iranian headed to India, for fast promotion through the Mughal Empire, particularly as an administrator. Because although India was ruled by Sunnis, first conquered by the Turks, then by the Mughal, then ruled by the Pashtuns, and then the Mughals, the culture was Iranian. And indeed, the Mughal Empire almost died right when it began. It was only thanks to the patronage of the Safavids that the Mughal Empire rose in India. So, what was happening in Iran. So from our vantage point, Iran was an obsession. It has been an obsession because the birth of the Mughal Empire and the death of the Mughal Empire are both thanks to Iranian kings or emperors. So the Safavids come to power 1505. That's the arguably the birth of modern Iran. And they expand the empire. They are rivals to the Ottomans. They are, of course, different ethnically and religiously. It is Shia Islam, which is the official religion, and they are in power for over 200 years. They ruled till 1722. There's a brief restoration from 1729 to 1736, but it doesn't last. The rulers claim to be Sayyids or direct descendants of the Prophet, and so they are fundamentally despots. In fact, Jean Chardin, yes.
So the resonance historically and relevance, both things, of this today would seem to be that the Persians, the Iranians, have a perception of self as a global imperial expanding power, whether they were at certain times or not. That is their self
Exactly.
defined image
Exactly.
relevant
Exactly.
today.
That's the right inference. So they've expanded. They've expanded both east. They've expanded west. They've expanded north. They had Azerbaijan, which is why Azerbaijan is largely Shia, and their empire. Jean Chardin pointed out that they ruled their land with an iron fist and often in a despotic manner, but it was largely a well-run empire. And they were culturally extremely significant. And the culture, particularly, was emulated in the East, Afghanistan, modern-day Pakistan, India. Now, Nader Shah, of course, takes over from the Safavids, and he proves to be a genius. But once he dies, it's basically chaos. Another dynasty comes to power, the Qajars, and they are largely incompetent. They start losing their territories to the Russian Empire. There are the Russo-Prussian wars, or the Russo, I don't know how to pronounce it, Russo-Persian wars. And bit by bit, they're losing land and influence. And of course, Britain, entirely out of the goodness of their heart, because they are such good Samaritans, they care so much about the welfare of other people and the planet. They say we can't possibly let Persia become a colony of the Russians, so we will intervene. We will counter the Russians to the north, and basically they just as they intervened in Egypt, they intervene in Persia, and Persia becomes a de facto colony.
Well, here again, we have to blame India. Because the British only were concerned with the Russian expansion over the unknown and seemingly irrelevant Persians because they threatened to obtain a warm water port, which meant that they might seize Constantinople. They might drive through which is an impossible thing to imagine, I think, but nonetheless, it was taken seriously. They might drive through Afghanistan, the Himalayas, and all the way to a warm water port in the Indian Ocean, or they might seize the Suez Canal. And that's why it was relevant to oppose what the Russians were doing to the otherwise largely ignored Persians at that point.
Indeed, at this time,
all of which was to protect the jewel in the crown,
exactly,
which was England's control of India.
So you're not being facetious. You're actually making a very important point that fundamentally they thought that if Russia took over Iran, it would have a warm water port. And from that warm water port, it could sail very easily to Mumbai or any of the ports on the western seaboard of India. So to protect British India, they intervened. And of course, it led to the Great Persian Famine of 1870-71, this struggle of power. And, of course, drought was a factor, and changing agriculture, bringing in cash crops was another, and poor governance was another. But the reality is that the Qajars were useless, feckless, and presided over a de facto colonization of Persia, just as Egypt was de facto colonized, again for India, for the Suez Canal, because that was the lifeline of the empire. And there is a Persian constitutional revolution that led. This happens between 1905 and 1911. Glenn, it leads to the establishment of an Iranian parliament, and things seem promising. But then there is a coup in 1921, and basically a Cossack takes over. A Cossack officer, Reza Shah Pahlavi, and the Pahlavi dynasty comes to power. It's an authoritarian government. It values nationalism, it values militarism, it values secularism, and it values anti communism. It also has strict censorship and state propaganda. So the Pahlavis, who pretend to be very ancient, basically are Johnny come latelys. And, and, um, and this happens in 1921. But before that, Glenn, something fascinating happens. And a chap called Winston Churchill is involved. And since you're the WASP here, you're the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you're more qualified to speak about Winston Churchill than me. So what happens?
I have yet to establish any genealogical link with Winston Churchill, although he was half American. A fact that was for which he was derided during his time as a politician in
didn't
England.
His mother sleep with 100 men or something? I mean, didn't his mother,
the beginning of the 20th century, really.
Didn't his mother sleep with 100 men and his father die of syphilis?
She was socially dynamic. That is certainly true. She was very beautiful, very accomplished, and most importantly, she was very rich. And it was the standard pattern of the second half of the 1800s when British noble aristocratic families, to save the estate and the manor, would seek to offer a title to an American in exchange for her wealth.
Yeah, American heiresses and British aristocrats, a tale as old as time.
That's right. But that takes us really to Berlin and to the research laboratories of scientists in the latter part of the 1800s, and to the naval race between Imperial Germany and Great Britain. The age of steel ships began really in the 1880s, and as Kaiser Wilhelm II, who came to power in what was the years, 1888 or thereabouts, I think, embarked on becoming a global power, which meant a naval power, because he always admired his grandmother's empire, his grandmother's Queen Victoria, and sought to develop a navy at least to rival that of the Royal Navy, the British Navy. The British, of course, felt this was a threat and responded. And so there was a great naval race at the same time that naval technology was moving to ironclads, to modern steel warships. Winston Churchill became a national political figure in the first years of the 20th century, and he was named First Lord of the Admiralty. I forget the first time it was, but it was prior to World War I. It was, I think, 1910. And he, in this regard, was a progressive. And with regard to imperialism in India, he was certainly not a progressive.
He was actually a member of the Liberal government, the great reforming Liberal government, first led by Asquith, Asquith, right, and then by Lloyd George. So this is something to cover another time. But Churchill was not a conservative at this point,
No, no.
and the great Liberal government of 1906 that took charge was perhaps arguably the greatest reforming government Great Britain has ever had. Over to you, Glenn.
Yeah. So yeah, he was not a conservative at all in the sense, but yes, we'll put that aside. Except as relevant to Iran and Persia, and that takes me back to where I was with British naval, German naval race. So at that time, steel ships had become just exponentially superior to anything in the world. Germany and Britain are in a race for naval supremacy. The Germans could never quite catch up. The British would do whatever was required to maintain superiority in the Navy. But that was not simply building steel warships, one, and two, what we're going to call dreadnoughts, which is a whole new technology, which was the battleship, which was the AI of the day. It was a qualitative, decisive element in warfare. But also, how are the ships powered? And there was the transition from sail to steam, but steam meant coal. That started in the 1830s, actually, and was complete by the 1880s, really, for modern navies. However, Churchill was a visionary, and he had been informed by the scientists advising the Admiralty in England, Great Britain, that petroleum was vastly superior as an energy source for the Royal Navy to coal. It gave ships vastly longer ranges. It had more power per unit, however you wish to define it. And so he took against the opposition of the, as always, more traditional bureaucracies of the militaries, the decision to change the Navy from coal to oil.
Very quickly, if I
Uh,
can add color, you're absolutely right. In October 1911, Churchill becomes First Lord of the Admiralty, and he takes up residence in Admiralty House. And Germany passes its naval law in 1912, and that is to increase warship production. And Churchill vows that for every new German battleship, Britain would build two. Churchill is determined to have a 2:1 domination of the seas, and he invites Germany to engage in a mutual de escalation. But of course, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who you correctly point out took charge in 1888, he's obsessed with this idea of becoming more like his grandma's country or becoming as powerful as his grandma, whatever. And he refuses. And that sets off that phenomenal arms race, one of the reasons for World War One. And of course, it's not just increasing the size of the navy because Churchill is curious. Remember that he's also a chap who's flying planes, nearly dies in one of his attempts, and basically he adopts this new technology, oil. Let's power ships by oil, and that puts Iran back into focus. Over to you, Glenn.
that's why, right. So he makes a decision. We're going to transition the Royal Navy instantaneously, if we can, as quickly as possible, to oil. And that made three places on Earth at that time particularly important. The first was the United States with Texas and Pennsylvania oil fields. But the Americans, uncouth as they were could be trusted on the whole. And so that wasn't too much of an issue. And we were also too big a boy to be easily bullied by the British. The British had finally conceded that point really in 1890 during a Venezuelan crisis over the Monroe Doctrine, but that's another secondary story. And then the other two places on Earth that really counted were the oil fields in Persia and the Suez Canal. At that point in the Gulf, the oil had not been really discovered or exploited. So it meant Persia, where there was oil. So that meant then that the British not only wanted to keep the Russians from attaining a warm water port, but that the land of Persia itself was important and needed to be taught what was in its best interest, which meant providing oil at favorable terms at any time to the British Navy. And that happened just before World War I, which led to a rich literature. One of the first modern spy novels is Green Mantle by a man named John Buchan, and it's the story of the Ottomans and the Germans, who were allies, trying to foment a jihad against the infidel British imperialists, so as to destabilize the empire's control of the oil fields, actually. And it never quite worked, but it made for a great novel, and actually was a significant effort on the part of the Ottomans and the British. So during World War One, then, from World War One on, the attention of Great Britain focused on Persia as a strategically important geographical spot or political entity. It didn't matter what the Persians did to themselves or who led them, so long as they would not endanger the security of the British Empire as protected by the Royal Navy, which meant the control of oil. During World War II, the same issues occurred. We jump ahead 25 years. So the British succeeded during World War I in maintaining access to the oil supply. World War II, the same issue comes up. This time, the Soviet Union, the successor to Russia, seemed even weaker, frankly, than at the end of World War I during the Russian Revolution. And so therefore, the Persian oil fields were even more in danger. And I think it was 1940, I forget the exact year, that the British decided to send troops to maintain the freedom from Nazi tyranny of Persia, which meant to protect the oil fields.
Glenn, let me add some color and correction. So it's
Please.
August 1941. So Reza Shah is still venerated by many people because a lot of people think he put an end to the decline under the Qajars. He brought law and order, discipline, central authority, modern amenities, schools, trains, buses, radios, yada yada, even cinemas and telephones. Now, reality is that, yes, that is true, but like many third world countries, it was fundamentally a corrupt police state. So that is true. And his role models increasingly became authoritarian countries such as fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Remember, Reza Shah is fundamentally uh, an officer he's an army officer. He does not come from high lineage. He has clashed with Shia clergy. He does not have the stardust of the Safavids. He can't claim to be a Sayyid. He's not
Oh, and the
someone.
appeal of a totalitarian model, be it Nazi, fascist,
Correct.
or communist, is overwhelmingly powerful
Yes.
when you're dealing with regressive factions, with the chaos of discord rather than theoretical democratic harmony, when you are a modernizer confronted with a recalcitrant, sullen, conservative society. This is at a time when even liberals praised the Nazis and fascists because they made the trains run on time and things were safe. And the Soviet life was the millennium arrived because everyone was happy and everything would be shared and everyone would get rich together. And so the appeal of this centralized, single party, militarized model was hard to resist.
And he's a chap who began his career in the Persian Cossack Brigade. Okay. So what were they doing? What is his background? He's a strong man. He is a military man. He's not averse to violence, and uh, he is a remarkable chap. And he is flirting a bit too much flirting a bit too much with the Germans, and so the British and the Soviets demand that he expel German residents from his borders. Reza Shah does not accede to their demands. So the two allies invade in August 1941. And yes, his Iranian army is fine when it comes to beating up the civilians and imposing authoritarian rule, but it's no match to a modern European army. And the British and the Soviets just strolled through. And now Iran becomes the major conduit of Allied Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union. So the US now gets involved for the first time in Iran. This is super important. The Persian corridor is
Right.
extremely important now. And
Which
Reza,
went through
and
Iraq up through
correct,
Iran into the Soviet Union.
correct. And it's Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, his young, feckless, um, dissolute son, who is put in charge. And in fact, such is the importance of Iran, such is the geopolitical importance of Iran, that there is a 1943 Tehran conference where the Allied Big Three, Joseph Stalin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, issued the Tehran Declaration to guarantee the post war independence and boundaries of Iran. So we are now getting to the end of World War II, and now we have basically an Iran dominated by the British and the Soviets,
Right. And the
and
Declaration
America
of
involved for
43
the first time.
progressively. The Declaration was in part to quell increasing dissatisfaction and restiveness. The natives are restive by the Iranians at the Imperium of the Soviets and the British. And so, similarly to what the British did for the Jews in the Middle East during World War One, you promise a homeland and rights in the future, or the Indians independence. You promise independence to the Indians so that they won't completely destroy the British during World War II, and so on. It was the same approach, and it worked for a bit of time. So that gets us to the end of World War II in 1945 in an important conference, and it wasn't from one day to the next that England expired as the global power and the United States supplanted it, but from certainly from the end of World War II on, it was quite clear which the power was.
Glenn, may I jump
England had
in? May
been,
I jump in and
yeah,
explain to our listeners one very important feature after World War II, which most people overlook? Of course, you don't. Um, there was a grace for oil in the Middle East, and the US won big time in Saudi Arabia. The British screwed up big time.
right.
They annoyed,
That's where I was going.
yeah, they annoyed the House of Saud. They annoyed Ibn Saud. The legendary meeting between Roosevelt and Ibn Saud came to a deal that the US would guarantee security of Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia would basically guarantee oil supply to the US. And the
Right.
British basically had been in dominant position in that region. In fact, Lawrence of Arabia had blazed through that entire Arabian Peninsula, and they screwed up, and they were therefore doubly desperate to keep their hold on Iran, because
Well,
Iran
I
was
think
their.
you're a little, yeah, I think you're a little harsh to the British. I don't know that they screwed up so much as that they were unable. And this is the transition of power. It is pretty much a function of money, ships, weapons. And the Americans had all of them uh, literally exponentially more than anyone else. So that the British simply couldn't continue for all of their brilliance, and in many ways, their intelligence service, their foreign office are quite good. They didn't have the power, and that led to the famous meeting you mentioned between Roosevelt and the Saudi
We'll get into that
uh,
later, but they did
sheikh.
make mistakes in Saudi Arabia. Even the gift they sent, the Rolls Royce they sent to Ibn Saud, they forgot that in Saudi Arabia, uh, rulers like to sit next to the driver, at least in those days, and therefore, they got a lot of little things wrong, uncharacteristically. But you're right; they were bound to lose because the U.S. was the rising power.
Yeah, I think the pound used to excuse many errors, and the dollar did too. So one could consider Americans uncouth and ignorant, but they have the money, and so one will still make the deal with them because one doesn't have a choice
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the end. I think that was sort of it. Um, but Saudi Arabia, Roosevelt, and oil are relevant because of our focus on Persia. What this meant was that the British were being progressively supplanted as the hegemon, the global power, and the one interested primarily or able to take measures to secure the control of, frankly, the oil. And that was certainly the case, as you mentioned, in Saudi Arabia. In Iran, however, from the end of World War II for a number of years, for the next 8 years, the British remained first among equals, and they continued to exert more influence than anyone else until the early 1950s. And this is not necessarily because of specific errors the British made in Persia, but because of Britain's declining strength relatively.
And also, Glenn, rising nationalism and democratization.
Abs-
Because what
Absolutely.
happens in
Well, yeah.
1951 is a chap called Mohammad Mossadegh gets elected. Mohammad Mossadegh is a sophisticated man, is an educated man. He is obviously a nationalist, and he says, hang on a minute, we want the same deal as the Saudis have with the Americans. So the Americans give the Saudis 50-50, 50 cents to every dollar. And the British are giving us 16 cents to a dollar. And indeed, they are practicing creative accounting and probably giving us 10 or 11 cents a dollar. The oil is ours. We have a large population and it needs public services. Therefore, we should revise the contract. The British said a contract is a contract and forgot the concept of duress in common law. If I put a gun to your head and make you sign a contract, perhaps that contract is not exactly 100% valid. And the British.
Oh, you're splitting hairs. You're splitting hairs legally. Any gun would only be there to guarantee security. I'm sure. I'm sure there was no
Exactly. The
coercion.
British
Yeah,
are lovely people. They were all
sure.
they weren't going there for Persian princesses. Unlike Nader Shah, they didn't take 10,000 women and children as slaves from Iran. They were just there for the goodness of their hearts. Anyway,
So,
on a serious note, and
here.
this I'll put an end to this very quickly, is that this leads to the Abadan crisis. We won't get into details. There are plenty of articles on Fair Observer. You can read about this. I have written them. I've co-authored them. And long story short is that Mohammad Mossadegh nationalizes oil because he cannot reach a settlement with the British. And when that happens, the British say this is a violation of international law. They tell America, which is going through its McCarthy years, that there's a communist hiding under every bush and behind every sand dune. And Mohammad Mossadegh is a communist. And indeed, the legendary 1953 coup occurs, in which the CIA works
Oh,
alongside
well, you have to wait. You have
MI6.
to, you're jumping ahead much too quickly. You're much too quickly. There's some important nuance here, which is even more perfidious, actually. So Mossadegh becomes the prime minister of Iran, and he does represent certainly a democratizing aspiration of society. Whether Iran could have been a functioning democracy is debatable, but perhaps for them to have debated themselves rather than others, one would certainly say today. But he was pushing for this renegotiated terms of the contract with Great Britain, as you mentioned, Atul. The United States was involved as a mediator, and that actually touches upon, shockingly to me, my career, because someone I worked with briefly at the very end of his career, he was infinitely more powerful and illustrious and accomplished than I, but nonetheless, we did professionally overlap, and I was in the room with him on professional matters. Was an American named Vernon Walters. He was a general. He was a diplomat. He became deputy director of the CIA when I was beginning my career, and he was a polymath and he spoke a dozen more languages almost as a native. And he served as both American representative and as interpreter for Mossadegh in his negotiations with the Americans and sometimes with the British. The American position in 51, and I'm not that old, I wasn't even born then, but Verna Walters was there. The American position was to support the British and to support a negotiated solution, which is a way of punting to the British and sounding like you support everything. But we fundamentally stepped out of it to let the British do things and gave them ultimately our support, as we did the French in Indochina, much to our chagrin in both places in the end. But the British would never come to a deal, and Mossadegh then nationalized. And then the British, up to that point, the British approach to the Americans had been, we need your help because of violation of contract, and this man we want an honorable deal and so on, but that's the issue at hand, and he's a little uppity, but we can deal with him. When that was no longer working, the British changed their tune to the Americans because they identified the then Secretary of State in 1952, John Foster Dulles, who was deeply religious and therefore, as a conservative Christian, profoundly anti-communist. They identified Foster Dulles's anti-communism as the key to the American kingdom, and they presented the British grievances to him through, in part, Vernon Walters, who was just a conduit, that's all, he was not a dupe, as Soviet expansionism and a threat to the stability of the free world. Initially, the Americans, the State Department, and even President Eisenhower thought that was nonsense. But John Foster Dulles didn't, and the British worked on him. And they convinced him that Mossadegh was, in fact, a communist threat. And they said, let's protect, the free world from communism. And Foster Dulles agreed. And they said, well, we'll have to work together to maintain the stability in Iran, which really meant that the British intelligence service convinced the young CIA, the Americans through Foster Dulles, to overthrow Mossadegh. And so the British pulled the strings, convinced Foster Dulles that Mossadegh, who was a Persian nationalist, was a communist agent. He was not. He was hostile to communism. And that the British would protect the general interests when, in fact, the American action preserved the dominance of British petroleum and the Royal Navy.
Excellent. So basically, the British acted like the wily uncle manipulating the young adolescent to beat up an unruly and inconvenient neighbor, or not rival, maybe, or an upstart.
Upstart. That's right. That's
exactly. Exactly.
Which is all history which we should all ignore, because the overthrow of Mossadegh by a son of Theodore Roosevelt, who is one of the early senior CIA officers, was one of the triumphs of CIA history, leading to 75 years of unintended consequences. But yes, the CIA did foster the unrest that led to Mossadegh's fall.
Now, why is it important? Because 1953 is a seminal year for the Iranian consciousness. Because as we were discussing in preparation for this podcast, I pointed out to Glenn that whenever you interact with Iranians, not all of them, but quite a few, and particularly proud ones, you get both the inferiority complex of the colonized with the superiority complex of an imperialist, and it's a profound case of cultural schizophrenia, which you don't see in any other country. Actually, the Turks were never really conquered and ruled, and the CIA didn't just come in and conduct a coup. They had Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who threw out the Allies, actually. And yes, they have their trauma, but the Turks have a sense of great confidence, maybe unwarranted. The Russians, of course, they are imperialists, and those of you who want to read our piece on Vladimir Putin dating back to December 2021, explores all the thinkers that inspire modern Russia. Many of the colonies of Africa, or indeed South Asia, I mean, they do not have any sense of imperial memory at all. It was beaten out of them. But with the Iranians, the imperial memory never went away. And the resistance in recent past was crushed and snuffed out so brutally that it sort of animated the Iranian soul, so to speak. And what
So
happened from 1950? Yes, please, Glenn.
no, finish your thought, then
So I was
I'll
saying what
speak.
happened from 1953 to 1979 was tragic for Iran in many ways. Yes, Iran modernized in some ways. Yes, there were some land reforms. Yes, women could wear miniskirts. Yes, you had a very liberal scene in Tehran. Iran and Israel were allies, all of that. But what also happened was that a tiny elite soaked up all the resources that were coming in from the oil money. That tiny elite led opulent life, a very opulent life. The Shah was, as I said, feckless, weak, useless. Uh, as per rumor, he had he had a minister to procure him women from around the world. He had a coronation party in Persepolis to show that he was, to celebrate thousands, 5,000 years, God knows, 3,000, 2,000, 1,000. I don't even remember, but of Persian monarchy. And he was the son of an upstart. So, and he blew $800 million, or maybe in today's terms, $1 billion for this coronation party. And all the birds that were brought in died in the heat. And a sandstorm broke out, and all the guests were lined up in perfect makeup, and everyone had to kiss his hand inside the tent. And basically, they were all blown left, right, and center by the time they got in. It was madness. And it was theater of the absurd. But more importantly, he had a secret police called Savak that was brutal. He did not deliver uh, public services to the villages in particular. There was seething discontent. And because the opposition had been wiped out, there was no opposition party worth its name. Resistance came only through the clergy, because in a religious country, he couldn't have closed down all the mosques. And so, bit by bit, 1953, in some ways, or actually directly led to 1979. And Ayatollah Khomeini flies back from Paris. Thank you, France, very much. We can thank the French for a lot of things. And once he comes, Iran is a very different creature. It is a revolutionary power. And remember, 1979 is a big year because that is the year when the Grand Mosque in Mecca is
Right,
also
but stop there
besieged.
for a moment.
Yeah.
Stop there for a moment. I think so. Why have our 5,000 years of history, other than indulging our personal whims, uh, um, be of relevance to anyone who might be listening to us? Go on. I think the takeaways are significant. It's not just the fascination of ancient history. The fact that the Mossadegh regime or the Ayatollahs that we'll talk about in a moment are corrupt, totalitarian, exploitative, that the elites skim off 80% of the national wealth and leave 99% of the population with 20% or something like that. Those are not particularly distinguishing characteristics of Iran, but of most developing states with no democratic tradition. Rather, what comes out of Persia's history and now Iran's is, we argue at least, this sense, this self-definition as a global power, a center of culture, an imperial entity, that it's not expansionism or wrong for Iran to seek to exercise influence beyond its technical borders. That's by right and by history that they do that, and that culturally they remain important. One, two. that the foreign interlopers, most recently the British, are not simply viewed from an anti-colonial perspective, but as really aberrations that contradict, but can't possibly actually be true supplanters or replacements of indigenous Iranian greatness. And yet that the British first, and then their genealogical cultural cousins and successors, the Americans second, are invariably acting in ways inimical to Iranian interests. That then gets us to the third element that you just started to touch upon before I interrupted, which is Islam. Now, Islam has been obviously for 1300 years central to the definition culturally and politically of Islamic societies in the Middle East, which we can define as going from Morocco to Indonesia at this point. But as a response to colonialism and modernization, the two things not quite being the same, but strongly overlapping. And you had Mossadegh is a phenomenon of nascent modernism and nationalism, as you touched upon, and Islam
And just very
occurring
quickly,
at the same time.
he is the secular guy. He is the
Right.
honest guy. He is the intellectual. He wants to take Iran like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, although he's not a military leader, into a more modern and almost a European direction. He wants more revenue. He wants better tax collection. He wants better public services. He wants a modern state. So one response to colonization is modernization, and that is basically Mohammad Mossadegh. And the other response, as Glenn is pointing out, is religion. Over to you, Glenn.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I would view Mossadegh more as an Iranian Kerensky than a Kemal. He
That's
would
fair.
have,
That's fair.
yeah.
Yeah.
He wished to be a
Kerensky was a
modernizer
leader during the Russian Revolution, and he was supplanted by the Bolsheviks, for those of you who don't remember Kerensky or don't know Kerensky.
because single party, single mindedness, as in the Bolshevik communists, can direct power generally more ruthlessly and efficiently than a pluralistic Democrat. And there's a gross simplifications, but that partly is what did in Kerensky during the Russian Revolution, and arguably weakened Mossadegh in his dealings with the British in particular at the time. So, but Islam becomes a major element now of national honor, of cultural honor. How can we know that our culture is pure and we like our culture even with its failings? And how is it that the usurper, the outsider, the alien, is ruling us? And this is part of the response of what we have come to call radical Islam, which is, well, that can't be so. So we have to purify our society and expel the outsider. That basically defines the Islamic revolutions and jihadist movements of the last of the entire Western colonialization period, and certainly of the past 50 years. And that's what happened with Ayatollah Khomeini, who led the revolution in 1979 and overthrew a corrupt, beholden to the West, therefore alien Shah. Uh, and that's the third element that I think we argue defines Iran today and leads to the understanding of why Iran seems to be so hostile to Israel and to the United States. Is it only that the United States is this imperialist power um, with no business in the Middle East, or is there something else? And I think that's the foundation of what we would call modern 1979 to the present Iran.
Exactly. Through Iranian eyes, if you view the world through Iranian eyes or Islamic eyes, even, 1953 is original sin in the Middle East. And we've explained to you, therefore, why um, the United States is the great Satan. Uncle Sam is the great Satan. And Uncle Sam's ally, the Jewish Crusader state, which has turfed out fellow Muslims, is a big rival in the region because pre 1979, Iran has a relationship to Israel which is similar to Turkey's. They are at they're at ease with Israel. The Shah is fine, even though the Shah is also has illusions and delusions of grandeur and begins a nuclear program. In fact, what people forget, it is not the mullahs who begin the nuclear program, it is the Shah, and it's probably as early as 1957. So the point is, but they can coexist. But once you have 1979, you have Ayatollah Khomeini, Ruhollah Khomeini, if I remember his first name correctly, taking over, then you have to purify, you have to get rid of the outsider, and by extension, you have to get rid of the great Satan from your region and the great Satan's lackey, the Crusader state, Israel. And yes, throw in the attendant anti Semitism of modern political Islam, where everything is a Jewish conspiracy, whether it is Hollywood or whether it is Harvard, whether it is Wall Street or whether it is modern media. So, if you go by that logic, both Glenn and I are dancing to the end of Jewish strings. So, there's a certain paranoia, a certain dedication to a new order, fundamentally transformative order, and a fundamentally, therefore, destabilizing nature to the regime that comes to power in 1979. After all, why would you pass a death sentence against Salman Rushdie, pass a fatwa, if you were just focused on providing better education and better water and better sanitation and better public services for your citizens? You wouldn't be doing that sort of thing.
Exactly. Well, what is the mission and the definition, sense of self of the revolutionaries from 1979 and of Iran? From the revolutionaries' perspective, it is anti-colonial. It is anti-West, the two things being quite similar. It's against the Crusader state imposition of Israel. It's against the Jew. It is to re-inhabit or revivify, I suppose, the Persian essence as a global power, certainly a regional one, which means that it's natural to seek to expand our influence throughout the Middle East. And something we did touch upon Islam as a reaction to, in some ways, these outside forces. But we haven't mentioned yet, really, except I think you did once quickly in passing, Atul, to the Shia-Sunni tensions within Islam. And Iran is a Shia state. It's the only major one. 10% of Muslims are Shia. The other 90% are Sunni. Broadly, you could view it from a Western or Christian perspective as the difference between Protestants and Catholics. Both are Christian. Both have spent 500 years killing one another. And similarly with the Shia and the Sunni for a longer period of time. And so to define itself as legitimate and its essence, the Ayatollah's regime from 79 on has been, and it was certainly a revolutionary movement and a revolutionary state, which meant that it was a destabilizing anti-status quo state for the entire Middle East. The question that was operative for my colleagues and I on the times that I did touch upon Iranian issues was, is Iran a revolutionary state still? And there were two schools of thought, as always. Those who said yes and those who said no. Certainly it was at the beginning. I personally argue that the revolutionary fires have died, but that it has been for its entire existence, the Mullah's regime, an anti-status quo destabilizing power in the Middle East, seeking to extend its influence with tremendous success for 50 years until really the last 2.5, I guess, since Hamas made its tragic error and hideous act of invading Israel and killing 1,300 Israelis in 2022, 2022, I guess it
Yeah,
was, or 2023, 2023,
2023.
2023. It's only since then that Iranian power has been rolled back, really as a result of Israeli arms. Now,
Very quickly,
Iran's
very quickly,
expansionism had a
very quickly,
well,
Glenn.
one second, one second.
Yeah,
Iran's expansionism had a great helping hand by the American invasion of Iraq, which I argued in one fell swoop succeeded in extending Iran's influence from the Iranian Iraqi border to the Tigris and Euphrates River, something that Iran had not succeeded in doing in 8 years of war. Um, but that has now been rolled back. And yet, my point, and then I'll stop, Atul, was that the other essence, I think, a way to understand specific Iranian actions and positions for 50 years, and certainly in the last several, has been that it defines itself and gives itself legitimacy by its opposition to these powers as a revolutionary state.
brilliant. Now, Glenn, I was going to support you on that point of Iraq, but you were going there anyway. So, what happens after 1979? Immediately afterwards, there's an 8-year war, 1980 to 1988, in which the U.S., including chaps like Donald Rumsfeld, back a chap called Saddam Hussein, because no one wants Iran to take over. And Saddam Hussein is a good buffer. He's a useful buffer against Iran. Is he brutal? Of course. Does he torture people to death? Yes. Uh, does he use chemical weapons against the Kurds and the Marsh Arabs, Shia Arabs? Yes. It's rather ugly what happens in Iraq, but uh, he does keep the Iranians in check after the war. The Iranians see themselves as a revolutionary regime, but unlike the Soviet Union, the appeal of the Iranian revolution does not go very far because of the Shia-Sunni divide. As Glenn pointed out, Shias are 10, maybe 11, maybe 12, but let's use the 10% mark. Um, most Indian Muslims are not Shias. Most Pakistani Muslims are not Shias. Pakistan persecutes Shias. Indonesia and Malaysia are not Shia. Azerbaijan is a Shia country, but they are in the Turkish arc of influence. They don't like Iran that much. So, really, Iran's appeal is limited. And Iran very much feels itself as a besieged power. They have a siege mentality. And so they do what perhaps the Hashishi did, the assassins. Go back, those of you who play Assassin's Creed, we know at least one listener plays Assassin's Creed, will remember how, assassins going around killing people. So they come up with asymmetric warfare and they start supporting Hezbollah. And that is an opening that Israel gives them by invading Lebanon in 1980. And that coincides with Glenn's. Is it 1980? Am I mixing my dates?
82.
82. 82. Yes. Sorry, I stand corrected. 1982. Yeah, I'm glad I caught it. So 1982, they invade Lebanon to get rid of the Palestinian terrorists or liberation organization fighters there. But reality is that that gives the opening, and Hezbollah emerges, and they also back Houthis. And over time, as different Arab states don't back Hamas, they manage to develop close relationship even with Hamas, even though Hamas is Sunni. But remember that Iran's influence is limited, and they are using these stray pockets like the Houthis in Yemen, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, non-state actors, and Hamas, which has been abandoned by everyone else and is being backed by Iran. And once the 2003 invasion occurs, and also in Afghanistan, Iran develops some influence, although the return of the Taliban puts an end to it. But long and short of it is that Iran has an imperial memory, tries to exert power at the same time it is feeling besieged, it feels under siege, and there is an entire debate in America whether Iran is no longer revolutionary, or is it just an abnormal state trying to extend power through other means? Eventually, when Barack Obama comes to power, Iran goes from being in the axis of evil to the Joint Comprehensive JCPOA. I always forget the full form. I just said it before the podcast. And here I am struggling for words.
It's the nuclear limitation
Yes,
agreement
Joint
between the United
Comprehensive
States
Plan
and
of
Western
Action.
powers,
Yeah.
which essentially had Iran agree to cease its nuclear weapons development, to open its facilities to inspection in exchange for an easing of sanctions by fundamentally the United States and European powers.
And this deal happens in during the Obama years, but Donald Trump walks away from it in 2018, and he launches the maximum pressure campaign. And eventually, what happens is that Israel and Iran, who've been fighting this proxy war for a while, trade missile attacks, trade attacks on each other's soil, and the matter escalates, and Israel starts conducting assassinations of high profile figures on Iranian soil. And eventually, of course, Israel launches a spectacular attack um, uh, on Iran after June 12th this year, because the International Atomic Energy Agency declares that Iran was violating its non-proliferation obligations. So, long story short, uh, once that happens, then of course the US gets sucked into, and US launches bunker busting bombs against Iranian nuclear facilities, and hits Fordo, Isfahan, Natanz, bunker buster bombs, sorry. And now we have a truce. And the question now arises, what happens going forward? Will we have peace and rivers of milk and honey? Everyone will sing Kumbaya. Will scenario one, which is the Shah returns triumphant and with his Jewish son-in-law in tow, and creates a new democratic uh, monarchical Iran modeled on the UK? Uh, or is there another democratic revolution? All the women come out on the streets because there have been tensions in Iran. Remember, women have been protesting. The regime, in some ways, has been losing popularity. The regime is now corrupt, just as the Shah's regime was corrupt. Maybe not as flamboyantly corrupt.
I think yeah, that understates things significantly. That one sentence that has been losing popularity. The most pro-Western Muslim society on earth, the most pro-American Muslim society on earth, is Iran, and the support for the regime is, if not zero, very small throughout Iranian society.
Yeah.
The regime stays in power because they control all the means of force, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, who progressively are running the
Islamic
country.
Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, which is a state within a
Yes,
state.
they're becoming really the masters of the throne. They are, I would argue, are the ones with the guns, and so
I mean, they do
overwhelming
have
majorities.
support in villages, in the rural areas still, and the religious
Yeah,
elements of society. That's
yes,
how they recruit soldiers.
that's true. Yes, that's true. I mean, they are non-existent. The support's not non-existent, but a relatively small minority. But they're the ones with the weapons,
Yeah.
and as we learned, it was our Stephen who pointed this out to me before. I'll repeat myself this time correctly. Mao pointed out the revolution comes at the end of the gun, and they control all the guns. So that is likely to be
So let's
the
go through the
short-term future.
scenarios. The Shah returns, unlikely. Scenario one. Scenario two, there's a democratic revolution, unlikely as of today. Scenario three, the IRGC takes over and Iran becomes a Pakistan ruled by a military dictatorship, or in Egypt. That's scenario three. Maybe they become more realistic. Scenario four is the Mossad wet dream. Iran disintegrates. The Azerbaijanis take the Azeri bit. The Balochs, funded by the Saudis, they go their own way. The Kurds, they also find their opportunity, the window of opportunity. The ball breaks loose from the scrum, to use a rugby metaphor, and the Kurds run with it. and so on and so forth. And then Iran is left as a rump state. Scenario five, um, scenario five, that things just meander along as they are for the foreseeable future. The status quo persists. So, Glenn, since you are a geopolitical guru and you used to brief the White House, what does the crystal ball tell you?
Yeah. Well, but we can't predict anything. It does strike me most likely that those with the means of imposing their will are most likely to impose their will. What you called scenario four seems to be the most likely for the short and medium term, and that would be that if the regime continues to slowly fritter and crumble, its legitimacy largely lost already, that it would be replaced by a militarized faction, which would probably be the IRGC, running, as you, I think, um, accurately describe, as some Iranian Persian version of a Pakistani military state. It is less likely, but not inconceivable, that there be such unrest and dissatisfaction that the society crumble, because it's not homogeneous at all. You have multiple ethnic groups with different heritages and aspirations, and it's possible that chaos would lead to fracturization. We did see that in Syria. Uh, the shock to Syria was substantially greater than any shock Iran has felt. Um, so I don't think that is likely, but it's not an inconceivable thing. And then, that everyone, milk and honey arrive, and the biblical prophecies be realized. Um, Unlikely, but also not inconceivable, because a majority of the population, if not secular, is more moderate and tolerant in their aspirations, theoretically, than they have had to, the regime under which they've had to live for 50 years. So if there were a strong leader who could wield some significant element of the power of the state around which others could rally, a relatively more liberal evolution of Iran is not inconceivable. But I think of those three scenarios, it's significantly, by a good degree, the least likely of the three.
Yeah.
And the Pakistan model is the most.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a difference to
Because we haven't
Pakistan.
mentioned that the
Yeah,
Ayatollah Khamenei is 89 years old, I think it
yeah,
is
yeah,
now.
absolutely.
Um,
And he's not a good
the
orator.
current leader.
He's not a good
Yeah.
orator. He's not charismatic. And I think we have to mention a few things very quickly here. Number one, for all their faults, the mullahs have brought in, near universal literacy. So Iran is not Pakistan. So Iran is a more sophisticated country with very high female literacy. In fact, that is why there are tensions within society. Iranians are a sophisticated bunch. They are educated and even skilled. Um, Iran also geopolitically has its rivalries not just with the traditional Sunni rivals, the Ottomans, modern day Turkey now, which is a new Ottoman power, but also rising Saudi Arabia, which is fomenting trouble in Balochistan. It has problems with the Sunnis in Iraq. Yes, the Shias in Iraq are more under Iran's thumb, but Iran also has problems with neighboring Sunni Pakistan, which is to its east. Um, Iran also has to navigate a tricky relationship with Russia and even China. So Iran is swirling like a swirling dervish in in very choppy in a sea being no in a ship being tossed around on sea in very choppy waters.
Actually, this is a tertiary point, I suppose, but all of my Indian interlocutors, this is a standard Indian refrain, will berate me as the representative of American government, because of what I used to do, for America's cozying up to Pakistan, which is terrible because Pakistan's this awful state, and India is innocent, and so on, and it never understands what possible motivation that there might be for that. And the answer is pretty simple, which is that Pakistan could help the United States. Well, there are multiple reasons, but help the United States in Afghanistan, help the United States on some aspects of Islamic jihadism, help the United States in its effort to respond, if not contain, China, and uh, is happily located from an American perspective with respect to Iran, and could possibly help the United States um, do one thing or another towards Iran. So the U.S. approach to Pakistan is in part related to the U.S. objectives with regard to Iran. So it's a tertiary point.
No, that is a tertiary point, but important, that explains why Pakistan is geopolitically so relevant, and is part of the modern great game, because the Chinese, of course, see Pakistan as a place which offers them an outlet to the Indian Ocean, to the Arabian Sea, and therefore the Indian Ocean, and they have a port in Balochistan, and of course. It is tricky for Pakistan itself, but because if, say, the Mossad and the Saudis were to gang up and create an independent Balochistan, then Pakistan would lose Balochistan too, because Balochs live across the border both in Iran and in Pakistan.
Right. So let's try to sum up all of our, if not yammering, our scintillating assessments. Why is Iran relevant, and why is it as it is? And I think I'm not a determinist, neither geographically nor culturally, but geography and culture are critically important and explain much of the Iranian regime, independent of any supposed or actual attributes that we can ascribe to its Shia revolutionary uh, existence. So it has a sense as a great state, a one of the richest. I'm speaking culturally and politically and in terms of sophistication, cultures on Earth. Its rightful place is to influence, if not tell, its neighbors how to live and what they should do. It is anti-colonial. It is anti-Sunni. It's anti-Crusader Jew. It is resentful, wary of, paranoid about Western great powers, which means Great Britain and now the United States, no matter what they do. It is, of course, historically, but also in more modern terms, wary of and hostile to communism and other great powers around it. You just ticked off the ones that they are. So one could almost argue that the mullah's regime's positions, if not inevitable, certainly are the direct products of its history, of Persia's history, independent of the Shia revolution of 1979. But that has given it a more aggressive coloration for the past 50 years. And that now finally, we both tentatively argue, I guess, um, the um, the game may have be running out for the mullahs, but that the future post mullahs doesn't look especially bright either.
Exactly. And those of you who have read our piece, 2021 piece, December 2021 piece, and heard our podcast on Russia, on Vladimir Putin, might remember that, yes, there was a time when people had lost belief in communism, when politically correct speak in the Soviet Union meant homage to hypocrisy, really. It came out of fear, not love. And yet, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it did not lead to rivers of milk and honey. It did not lead to free markets, blue jeans, rock and roll, and everybody having a jolly good job in a fantastic company. So, yes, the regime is toxic. The regime may be suffering from terminal cancer. It's not just Ayatollah Khomeini who's at risk. Uh, the regime itself is at risk because young Iranians no longer believe in Islam quite often. They leave aside Shia Islam. Iran is increasingly, the young tend to rebel, and the young have become increasingly secular. And they are yearning for something different that does not automatically guarantee that what emerges will be wonderful and peaceful and modern and multicultural and all that jazz. So, with typical Cassandra like cadence, we've come to the end of this podcast. We'll be back with something even more interesting next time. So, tune in.
See you later.
Bye for now.